Right, so it's a rainy Monday morning in December, and I'm very pleased to welcome Sana Ali from TAPFIN back to the podcast. How are you, Sana?
Very well, thank you. And like you said, enjoying somewhat this miserable rainy weather in the UK.
Exactly, making the most of it. Um, so we've had a great conversation. I've really enjoyed our previous conversation on the podcast. Can you remember, or how long ago do you think that was?
Oh, blimey. I want to say about a year ago, although it could have been less because this industry moves so fast and so quickly.
It was actually, and I was really surprised when I checked this morning. It was September 2021.
Wow,
I know.
goodness me. So
Time
over 2 years then.
time has absolutely flown by. Um,
Indeed, it has.
but I'm delighted to have you back on the podcast. And today
Super.
we're going to be talking about looking at SOW solutions in a little bit more detail, just in terms of the different levels of solution that are available on the market, that people are considering, that people are utilizing, what's
Yep.
appropriate for who, and kind of looking at this low touch versus high touch debate, which I think is a really interesting one, especially as since the last time we spoke, the market has progressed in some areas, and it has certainly progressed with the way that certain companies and MSP providers and tech providers are offering their services. So before we dive into it, you gave a brilliant introduction to yourself in our last podcast. For those that haven't listened to it, would you just be able to just do a super quick recap of just who you are, what you're doing at the moment, and a brief
Absolutely.
background?
Absolutely, and hopefully I can do it justice again. So I am, my official title is the Global SOW Delivery Director, or SME. When it comes to statement of work, I work for Talent Solutions TAPFIN organization, which is an MSP or a managed service provider. And ultimately what my role is as I come from an operational background, I've kind of delivered a number of different SOW management solutions on the MSP front for different organizations and within different industries. My role is ultimately to ensure that actually any solutions that we are selling are operationally viable, and making sure that any implementations, expansions, and anything related to SOW on the ground is kind of there to support the client. We've got the right level of strategy, right level of conversations, right level of intellect and guidance and education that is being provided. But then also working a little bit behind the scenes to ensure that our overall organizational strategy when it comes to SOW management or services procurement is up to par and is fit for purpose and aligned with the ever moving and evolving market and industry today.
Yeah, brilliant. Thank you very much for that. It's hugely important to make it work in the real world, isn't it?
Exactly. And there's a number of horror stories that we can certainly talk about offline, which I know you and I have already touched on to an extent as well, if it's not done effectively.
Yeah, and all things sound great in principle, but
Exactly.
in the devil's in the detail, in the real world, things are generally a little bit more complicated. Funnily enough, I sometimes find that in emerging spaces like this, sometimes actually people will think it's more complicated than it
It
necessarily
is.
needs to be,
Yeah.
which can lead to it becoming more complicated.
Yeah.
Which I think is, certainly something that I've seen. Um, but these are emerging solutions, really. It's not something that's like everybody's adopted. It's completely mainstream. It's still fairly nascent in the market.
Exactly.
Cool. So in terms of looking at the service that is provided to an organization, the basis of it is that an organization has an issue with services procurement, the management of that spend, or as some would term it, statement of work, managing statements of work. How do they deliver statements of work? How do they manage that? How do they measure it? What systems is this information captured in? Is there any information? Who's controlling it? It's a massive area of spend for most organizations.
Yeah.
We're talking about 20 trillion global annual spend, something along those lines. It's big. In some organizations, banks, for example, it could be 90% of their spend
Exactly.
procured services. Manufacturing, it may still, even in a heavy manufacturing industry, it may still be, 30 to 50% of their total overall spend. So it's important. And when I talk about services procurement, when you talk about services procurement, because we're kind of like industry insiders and we're like really in the zone with this, we might use that phrase. Whereas for some organizations, you know, they'll just look at indirect categories that are relevant to complex services. So we sometimes talk about complex services categories, but although statement of work is a kind of like a bit of a boring phrase in some ways,
a bit of an all-encompassing term as well, I think.
it is, because it at the center of these transactions or these engagements is the statement of work, and the fundamental things that make that different from the way that you would procure goods and materials from a third party make it important, make the statement of work important, how it operates, how it needs to function, and also the way that it's different from buying contingent labor, from, you know, contracting an individual's time, are the essential factors that always, interestingly, make the statement of work just so important. Just the idea of managing SOW spend. It's spend that's moving through a process, contracted in a certain way that needs a specific piece of attention.
And I think you've mentioned something really, really important there as well, because when you look at the statement of work spend or portfolio ultimately, or category, whatever you want to call it, I think there are sometimes some misconceptions as part of that. So you mentioned contingent. There's completely different processes, completely different approaches to manage as an organization, your contingent spend or your contingent workforce ultimately. And albeit there are parallels between the world of contingent workers and statement of work, there are some really, really fundamental differences. And I think going back to the point that you raised, that sometimes organizations can make it a slightly more complex piece of work than it needs to be. And I think that's where sometimes maybe the lack of understanding or awareness with what those fundamental differences are between managing your contingent spend and your statement of work spend, even though they both fall within that non-permanent workforce category, they are very, very different areas of spend and different approaches, change management, adoption, and all of those fun sort of buzzwords that you want to throw at it, that really truly go into the management of each of those pots, so to speak.
Yeah, absolutely. And the way that organizations will define or bracket this spend can completely vary. Like some organizations, their procurement setup might be very much direct versus indirect. But even that could be complicated, because you could be dealing with a manufacturing organization where all of the kind of statement of work type spend, services procurement, will sit within indirect spend or within indirect categories. But you could be looking at a building construction consultancy firm where 99% of their direct spend is actually consultancy and professional services. That's what they're selling through third parties. So even that setup can vary, but if you're talking about statement of work spend, it could sit within various different categories within an organization.
Exactly. And sometimes the geographical market also is what kind of indicates where that SOW sort of term or SOW spend sits within the different categories internally. So, not to go down a little bit of a rabbit hole here, this is a little bit away from the conversation that we're having, but there are elements that, if you look at the European markets, there are a lot of European locations within that EMEA market that will dictate actually whether or not that definition of an SOW is indeed an SOW as we would see it, say, perhaps in the UK versus the US and other locations across the globe. But there might be certain nuances or legislative elements that actually direct what an SOW and where it needs to sit within an organization and how it is categorized. So I think if we kind of add that as a slight caveat, because albeit we're saying sometimes organizations can make this topic a little bit more complex than it needs to be, I think there is an element there to acknowledge that there are some complexities that really need to be simplified, but it's what is the right time and what is the right area to focus on to try and simplify some of those processes.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, ultimately, if you're buying contingent labor, you're buying an individual's time. If you're buying goods and materials, you're buying a thing.
Goods and materials.
If you're buying services, you are outsourcing some work to an external organization that will deliver that work for you based on some sort of output.
Exactly.
And that's where it comes back to that central point of that is a statement of work contract, and there are going to be and there will be deliverables within that contract, whether they're pure milestones, whether they are KPIs, whether they're sprints in an agile process, whether they're blocks of consulting or whatever it might be. So there's nuances within it, but it's a great central point. And I know we kind of dived into this fairly deeply at the start of this conversation, but I think it is relevant because that's what it comes down to. We're dealing with a type of spend here that needs to be dealt with specifically to get the most out of it and to make sure that you're compliant and to actually drive value from it, which is, you know, I think it's quite often been seen as something within some organizations that they don't necessarily realize there's a solution out there.
Absolutely.
And they might just think it's just too difficult because it's a big area of spend. It goes across categories, but fundamentally there are solutions out there to make this much more effective, and that's where you see the great success stories. So diving back into the kind of first area I wanted to cover, which is just looking at those service levels. So when an outsourced organization, a third party is providing a service to help an organization look after this spend, manage that spend for them, there are various different ways in which that can be done. Would you be able to just outline, as you see it in the market, the kind of different service levels that really exist at the moment?
Yeah, absolutely. So I would say there's 3 fundamental service levels, but I am going to throw in a cheeky 4th one as well.
Christmas bonus 4th.
That's it, a Christmas bonus, indeed, which I'll talk about and explain why I'm sort of defining that as a 4th one. But if we take those sort of fundamental 3 different service levels that we're talking about, so I'd say, I don't want to use the term basic, but I would say the slightly more simplistic time and material or T&M type arrangements that you would have. And what that ultimately means is where you are still looking to procure a service from a third-party outsourced supplier to deliver something specific. But in terms of the commercial construct that you have, it's based off of man hours, ultimately. Now, I know within the industry today, there is a little bit of a grey area with what truly falls within that. Is that right? Should T&M really be associated with statement of work spend? But we'll park that maybe for another conversation at a later date.
just to dive in very briefly on that. If this scenario is saying it's Sana working 5 days a week, for me, that's contingent labor. If it's the supplier is going to deliver 10 days of consultancy, I'm not worrying about, it's not my business who's going to deliver that consultancy.
Exactly.
If it's structured in the right way, that's different to saying it's a specific individual doing X amount of hours and there's no outputs.
Absolutely. Absolutely. And I think that's the key thing with T&M really is for it to be true and valid and right when it comes to statement of work, is that it's purely, and as I mentioned, it's purely the commercial construct that is dictating. It's not dictating who is doing it, or as an organization, if I'm the buyer, I should not be concerned in any way, shape or form which individual bodies are going to be delivering that work for me and how many and how for that matter. For me, I'm going to receive this specific deliverable, this specific outcome that is to be achieved. And for you, supplier, it's your responsibility to provide 5 resources against it to do the work, 2 resources against it to do the work, however many, whomever you want to align. But that commercial construct is what's baked in based off of that resourcing arrangement. But again, from a buyer perspective, your focus should not be on, I want to get involved and sort of dictate the day-to-day goings on or how these individual resources are going to be providing those outputs. For you as a buyer, it should just purely be, this is the commercial construct that I'm going to be paying for. It's driven and led by the resource arrangement. But what I am focusing on is, has that outcome been achieved? Doesn't matter who's achieving it, how it's being achieved. I say within what timeframes, but that does play a little bit of a factor regardless. But who and by how many individuals it's being done, that should absolutely not be a concern whatsoever.
I love the fact you dived into the stickiest, most thorny topics straight away. Yeah,
Wow.
I appreciate what you're saying. Yeah, absolutely. I mean, ultimately, as I say, I always come back to the thing of if you're procuring a service, you're looking for an output from a third party, and they're going to deliver some sort of result for you that you are predetermining, and you're building the contract around that. And ultimately, you see contracts where there may be some of the deliverables are pure milestone, or some of the milestones are pure deliverables. And within that, there might be chunks of consulting spend, for example, or SMEs coming in to do various bits and pieces. But ultimately, it's outsourcing the problem to that organization to say, you are delivering me a result. How you deliver that is kind of up to you.
Yeah.
You will get paid for delivering the results. But it's a fair point to dive into the kind of the fact that there are some kind of gray areas in it. And it's where organizations should be is doing this properly and making sure that they are compliant, and that the contract is structured in the right way, and that they're approaching it in the right way. Whereas I feel like after IR35 the reforms came into the public sector, there were some organizations that just sort of thought, oh, well, all the contractors, we can just put them on the statement of work. And it's
that's
no.
it, exactly. It was sort of, you squeeze one pot, we'll expand the other one. But yeah, that's not quite the way.
Well, I imagine that must be one of the big drivers, or over the last few years, that must be one of the remits. Certainly, if you look at the UK, that must have been one of the quite big remits where organizations were saying, okay, right, we need to bring in some external expertise because this has got a bit out of hand. There's been pressure on this contracting stuff, and there's this other stuff over here that there's some grey areas, there's some funny business maybe going on that we need to get on top of it.
That's it. And I think that has been, particularly from the UK market, that has been a huge sort of explosion as part of that IR35 conversation, because it's legislation. It's not a choice that organizations any longer have. If they've got SOW spend or services procurement spend within the UK, it's no longer, oh, well, if we've got the time or it's part of our strategy and priorities, we'll tackle it. Otherwise, if it's not broken, why fix it, kind of thing. Again, it's legislation that's come into play. It's a legal requirement for you as the organization, the buyers of these services, to ensure that you have the right protocols and the right level of governance and control in place to ensure that whatever is funneling through that particular category of spend is right and true within itself. So that, somewhat biasly from an MSP perspective, that's been wonderful, because that's meant that a lot of organizations have said, and there's levels to it. We've had a number of organizations that have said, actually, we want a little bit of guidance and recommendation, but only within this area. We've got a good handle and good level of maturity within area Y. But then there's some organizations that actually, based off of their scale and size, they might sort of say, well, we don't really know, just pretty much tell us what we need to do, or take ownership of that and support us along the way. So again, biasly from an MSP perspective, it's been wonderful with IR35, because it's given us the momentum to get this conversation off the ground a little bit. It's created a lot more demand for organizations to entertain this topic and really say, right, we acknowledge that there's a lot of spend going through this SOW category or services procurement category, and we acknowledge that it's complex or can be complex, but we need to get our hands across this. We need to get a little bit of a handle on it.
Yeah, and it's interesting when you look at the service providers delivering in this area, for certainly a large percentage of them, this would sit alongside the work that they do around contingent workforce.
Exactly.
And therefore, for some organizations, there'll be a trust element conversation around, well, this organization is assisting us with contingent workforce. We've got a great relationship with them.
Yeah, but there's a partnership already there.
Yeah, so there's a partnership already there, but sometimes there'll be the resistance of, but what do these guys know about services procurement? And I think that's where it's interesting to see the expertise being built up within some MSPs specifically to really bolster this area as the demand has increased and as the market matures. But also in some areas, you're seeing total specialists just focusing on this area.
Absolutely.
But the other side of it is that I always find quite interesting. It's about work capacity for the organization.
Absolutely.
So ultimately, it's still a problem-solving exercise around how the organization gets work done. And engaging contractors or outsourcing a service are very different, and they need managing specifically. But from a C-suite point of view within the organization, the C-suite just want to know, what capacity have we got? What are our capabilities? How do I manage the demand of what I've got to deliver via the permanent workforce, via our ability to flex up and down with contractors and temps, and by our ability to outsource to service partners. So in that respect, you can see how it's a similar problem-solving exercise. But I'm encouraged to see much more expertise coming into the market and a more mature view of it going out there, and more people just understanding that there are actually solutions out there specifically for this problem.
Exactly. And I think that's the key thing as well. And I sort of said biasly from an MSP perspective, there was IR35's drummed up a lot of business, but I think the key thing to remember here for an organization, I wouldn't say there's necessarily a right or wrong answer. Do you need to involve an MSP? Do you need to involve an outsourced third party, regardless of whether it's an MSP or not? I think the key thing is it needs to be right for you as an organization. And to your point, there's always a solution for everything, but is that solution right for you? And is the timing and the prioritization of it right for you? And if it means that actually you need a little bit of hand-holding and support, then great, there's nothing wrong with that. If you don't, then again, great, there's nothing wrong with that, because you may be what I would refer to as a second generation organization client that actually is really well versed within this industry, really understands their spend in specific detail and granularity, has great capabilities in-house already within your procurement, your sourcing, your category teams, to be able to take what you're doing today to that next level. And again, there's nothing wrong with that. It doesn't mean that, because there's MSPs out there, you have to get the support of an MSP. I think it is just knowing that there's always a solution for whatever challenge or pain points that you might be facing. And there's no right or wrong way to approach it. There is to an extent, but in terms of whether you go with a helping hand outsourced by a third party or whether you take that ownership and control yourselves, there's nothing wrong with that. It's just making sure that that solution is right for you as an organization and what your objectives and strategy and priorities are.
Yeah, in almost every case, it's better to be doing something about it than nothing about it. And it doesn't matter whether it's in Europe, the US, or anywhere else in the world. For most organizations, they don't have control over this type of spend. They don't really know what the money's going towards. They don't really know what good should look like. And it's very, very difficult for them to pin down any kind of value on it. So doing something, definitely better than doing nothing. So in looking at the service levels, you've got the very basic kind of entry point where to a certain extent it can sit in a gray area of what exactly is this spend. But categorizing that, as you put it, around that kind of simplistic type of a statement of work type of arrangements. What do you see? So you mentioned the three initial levels. That was level one. What do you see as the second level of service that you're seeing in the market?
So level 2 would be what I'd sort of say your mid-level tier or your mid-level, and it's ultimately a combination of your slightly more simplistic time and material T&M type arrangements combined with more robust fixed price arrangements. So again, if we look at the sort of the statement that I'd made earlier around T&M, you're still expected to have clear outcomes and deliverables that need to be achieved as part of the delivery of that particular piece of work and project, but it's the commercial construct that is aligned to the sort of the type of resourcing that the supplier is providing to ultimately execute and deliver that work. Now, with your sort of mid combination level, I would say it's a combination of T&M, fixed price, same kind of theory, same logic goes behind it in the sense that there's still outcome-based deliverable work that's being done, but that commercial construct could be a combination of tied to resources that are being delivered because they are particularly niche individuals that are being provided to ensure and oversee the actual outcomes being achieved, with a combination of actually there might be set tasks to achieve that final outcome and deliverable that actually are fairly kind of granular, in the sense that it's, say, if you're looking to build a car, it's actually, you've got that fixed price piece that's the structure of the body of the car. That could be sort of fixed price. Maybe that's not the best analogy, but there's certain elements that are kind of fixed in its nature, that it is what it is. It's somewhat simplistic in the sense that it's quite clear cut what the outcome is to be achieved for this. It's quite quantifiable. So a combination of those two elements. Now, what I would say again, for a lot of organizations, I don't tend to see that combination. I do find that it's one or the other. So one or the other in the sense that it's fixed price arrangements purely. You've got the bulk outcomes deliverables, specific acceptance criteria per those, or you've got T&M style arrangements. There tends to be a little bit more of, I'd say, lack of desire or demand to want to merge those. But I think that in itself, for me, from where I'm seeing the market headed, I think there is quite a beauty of combining those two elements together. And I am starting to see a lot more organizations wanting to ask the questions and say, right, okay, so maybe today how we're managing what we're referring to as the slightly more basic T&M type arrangements, and how we are managing those truly strategic fixed price arrangements. Maybe there's a world between the two, actually, to merge some of these and come with something that's not super strategic, high level, high end, but actually you've also got some of those on the ground, slightly more day-to-day style delivery, execution-based type statement of work arrangements, to merge those two worlds together to, again, give you as the buyer exactly what you're after within the timeframes that you desire.
Yeah, it's interesting. I mean, I always think the way that it's delivered shouldn't really, in my opinion, be tied into just a commercial want of how an organization or a supplier wants to structure. It should be what's the most effective.
Exactly.
So you use the building a car analogy. I hate to bring up the digging a hole analogy, but it is what it is. Ultimately, are you paying Johnny to go into the garden and for paying him per hour to dig in the garden, or are you paying me to say I want a hole that's 4 foot deep and 3 foot wide and whatever it might be? So
exactly.
So it's about what's the most effective way to deliver the outcome that the organization needs. This is where it gets into the definition of what that outcome is as well, which can be hard to define up front. If you look at an agile process, for example, there's an iterative definition of what the end outcome actually will be. And there are various wonderful things that you can do within that statement of work format, whether it's change requests and variations as you build out the milestones as you go, to move with the go with the flow as a process evolves. So yeah, I think it's all about what the best way to do it is. And
Johnny, you might have beat me already to my bonus solution of base.
What is that? Does that
away before we talked about the third one?
Does that involve me having to go into people's gardens and dig holes? That's all I'm asking. Hopefully not.
Well,
not very good. Oh, I think my back's just gone. So yeah, I'm quite sort of I have quite strong feelings that it should be about not trying to say I want to do it this way. It should be what's the most effective way.
Exactly.
Yeah. So sorry. Anyway, carry on. So that's point number 2. Before I steal any more thunder, I'll pass it back to you.
Brilliant. So the third and final sort of service level that I would say in terms of the foundation of it is your more complex, more strategic, high dollar value type of arrangements. Now this for me is more aligned to, again, strategic is the key word here, is where you've got a supplier, so an outsourced supplier that you've brought in to ultimately guide you and recommend to you how you should be running certain parts of your organization. And this doesn't happen across every industry, I would say. I've certainly seen it a lot more common within the financial services industry. So you'd have what the sort of the organizations would refer to as run the bank versus change the bank. So there's elements there, but it's ultimately the more strategic type of arrangements where, again, it's less about a service per se. It's more so there's still outcomes, there's still a clear deliverable, still a quantifiable end game that needs to be achieved, but it's more aligned to a third party supplier coming in to give you that level of guidance and recommendation at a very high level, strategic level. And they're a lot more where you need, and that's again, as I said, they're higher dollar value requirements that come in. So you tend to have the procurement teams, your sourcing teams, your category teams. I know there's a number of terms different organizations use, but those type of teams that will be very, very hands-on. And there will be a lot of kind of control at the start to ensure that that level of detail around the contractual construct is there to ensure you've got really, really clear acceptance criteria, really, really clear before that outcomes in terms of what needs to be achieved. But again, it's the whole theme that we've been talking about. You're outsourcing that particular service, you're outsourcing that particular piece of work to that outsourced third-party supplier. So it's their decision to, as long as you've got the agreement, this is what I need to achieve within this time frame, this is what I'll be paying you, supplier. But how that supplier does that throughout that whole life cycle is entirely their decision to do so. So yes, you would expect to have some sort of touch points or some sort of elements and milestones that need to be achieved throughout the tenure of that particular piece of work. But again, it's how it's constructed and how and whom is delivering it is entirely the decision of the supplier that's doing it. But I would say that's probably the third element, where you're really looking at those super strategic, super high dollar value requirements, where it's not necessarily on the ground delivery that you would have for your sort of specific projects, such as building a car or digging a hole. But it's really, really sort of truly looking at it from a true consultancy strategic angle.
Yeah, absolutely. That's where it's, there's a lot of complexity, layer upon layer of it in some of these types of projects. Exactly. So you mentioned the bonus one.
Yes.
What was that? It sounds like I may have already kind of touched on it a little bit.
Yeah. So I think it's a bonus one in the sense it's not, I would say, a specific service level per se, but it's what you were sort of mentioning earlier. It's less about who's doing it and how effectively that work is being done and managed. So it's less what is this kind of contractual commercial construct of what is an SOW, but more as in how is it being managed, how is it effectively being delivered to achieve those outcomes. And there's different elements, I think, that come into that, because there's an element of, then if you look at this, who is going to support your hiring community, your stakeholder, to ensure that there's the right level of detail provided there. I think that then comes into a slightly different realm of this conversation to say, is there an element of, and if we go back to the point of low touch versus high touch, but if we look at it from a slightly different angle, in the sense of the approach or the delivery aspect of it, is, are we looking at it from a low touch perspective in terms of, is it self-service? Is it work that you think that actually your hiring community, your stakeholders can cater self-sufficiently themselves from start to finish, in the sense of inception through to sourcing, through to fulfillment, through to actually achieving what they need with those particular suppliers? Or is there an element of that high touch, somewhat white glove service, where actually the onus is somewhat taken away from the hiring community or stakeholders to kind of own that whole end-to-end piece, but you've got the likes of your procurement teams, your sourcing teams, your category teams to provide that level of guidance to ensure that actually that end goal is structured and managed effectively in a way that you are getting what you really are paying for from that particular supplier. So it's somewhat of a bit of a spin on this, and it's a bit of a cheeky bonus for.
I think it's a really relevant point to bring. I'm really glad you brought up for example, the self-service element of it.
Yeah.
I'd kind of
Yeah.
love to dive into that in a bit more detail in a second. But we see all sorts of different ways that people do this,
Yeah.
whether it's direct or whether there's an intermediary involved. There are so many different ways, whether it's public sector, private sector. Companies just approach it in different ways. Like, what's their culture?
Yeah.
How much do they just let people get on with what they want to do? And when you look at self-service, adoption is so critical.
Absolutely. And I'd say even before the adoption, there's an element of education. So actually, do you have enough sort of understanding? Have you evaluated that your hiring community, your stakeholders that you're willing to give away that control and ownership to, have the right level of awareness, have the right level of education and intellect and insights that they need to be able to make those right decisions? It can be such a minefield, because if you don't have that, then that adoption rate is very likely to be reduced.
Yeah,
and that success rate as well. I think adoption and success can work hand in hand. I wouldn't say they're mutually exclusive, but I would say in this element, absolutely, your adoption rate is ultimately your success rate.
Yeah, exactly. You can have the best process mapped out in on a PowerPoint presentation you want. If people aren't doing it,
exactly.
So I think the self-service point is really important, in that you can really streamline the process, and using modern technology, and whether you've got an intermediary or not, you should be empowering individuals who are buying, that you should be making their life easier. And actually, you should be making their life easier for the supplier as well.
Absolutely.
Yes,
Absolutely.
maybe the work you're doing is more visible, but also it's clearer that you've had acceptance criteria and you've had a milestone approved, and you should be getting paid for it. And you've got terms around that, and everybody knows it's there, it's signed off, it's visible. So having that self-service on a kind of life cycle basis, where you've got suppliers self-serving, buyers self-serving, it gives procurement, and I would see intermediaries, MSP intermediaries, for example, as just augmenting that procurement function. So whatever that procurement or augmented procurement function looks like, it can lean in or out of the process as much as it wants.
Absolutely.
So it could be that you've just got everybody self-serving. They're used to just being very independent. You just say, carry on being independent.
Yeah.
Just capture it in this workflow, in this system, and this process. Make it and make that good for them, so they're getting a good experience. The suppliers are also getting a good experience, and they're finding they can just crack on with it. And the benefits of being compliant and all this sort of thing tie into that. And then it could be that this procurement element of it, whether it's augmented or not, could actually just maybe have visibility to start with.
Yeah, absolutely.
Or they can really get involved and actually layer on the controls where necessary. But just
and I think this is, I'm sorry to interject, but I think this is really where that whole piece around first generation client versus second generation client, and I'll kind of explain that in a little bit more detail. So I alluded to this earlier, but when I say first generation client, what I'm ultimately meaning is where you've got an organization that has really, really limited visibility and understanding and insight within what is housed within their statement of work spend category. They, even sort of some of the more fundamental elements, like what is being defined to sit within that SOW spend category. What is it? There's a massive gray area for that. Forget about all of the other elements that come with that. I would say that is what I would refer to as a first generation client, where there's limited understanding of what your spend, what your data, what your organization really is doing within that space. But then with your second generation clients, it's where, you may have slightly more robust processes. You may have a lot more insight and visibility and data available to you within what is housed within that SOW spend category for you as an organization. And I think this is where the key of self-service versus empowering your hiring community, which is ultimately one and the same thing, or bringing in an outsourced party to provide support, or bringing in some support to allow you as an organization within your in-house capabilities to bolster those up and enhance those. I think that first generation versus second generation really is a key factor there for an organization. That would be one of my biggest recommendations when you're looking at your services procurement, your statement of work spend categories, to really take the time to understand and evaluate where within that spectrum of level of maturity that you sit, to then understand what is the first step for me to move up that maturity roadmap to enhance and evolve my processes and enhance and evolve that experience, where they're actually a big bang approach of having self-service to fully empower my hiring community is the best way, because again, I've got a lot of education and awareness already available, and my hiring community and stakeholders are well versed within what should be the lay of the land, versus actually there's not enough and there needs to be a little bit more of upskilling, a little bit more education, a little bit more training and support that's provided to be able to get that right level of adoption, that right level of change management to move up that maturity roadmap scale.
Yeah, and it is a shift. So the self-service thing, in some ways, it's partly like just a mindset of like, that's what you should be striving towards. We're all grown-ups. We all use technology and kind of organize things in our own personal lives. Let's not treat people like children, although they can't do it. Let's get people involved. But by the same token, it depends what start point you're kind of coming. I mean, one of the things I find really interesting is sometimes the front end of the process will get very much addressed in terms of internal stakeholders, and the supplier side of it can be left behind a little bit. So coming from a tech point of view, solutioning in this area, making sure that your suppliers are on board with it in both senses of the word, in the sense that they get it, they've been trained, they understand it, and systems are easy to use, and it's making their lives better. But secondly, get them on there, because once they're on there, that's where they live. And if you need to engage with them, that's where they are. And the process, if the process is good, happy days. But I sometimes feel like that can get a little bit left behind, whereas it's a fundamental part of it that if a supplier still sits outside the system or outside the program, then it's all too easy for people to kind of revert to type.
Yeah, fully agree. And I think there's two elements here really as well, because there's your tech capabilities, I think, that need to be focused on as part of that. But then there's also what I would refer to as your somewhat operational activities. And again, regardless of whether it's an MSP that you have in place that's managing that spend for you, or whether it's something that your procurement, your sourcing, your category teams are managing in-house, it's that level of capability from an operational perspective merged with the tech capability. Because something that I always say on this side of the fence from an MSP perspective, our solutions are people-led, but they're tech-enabled. And that tech-enabled piece is extremely important, because if you are trying to kind of shoehorn a round peg into a square hole, or excuse me, I've completely butchered that analogy, square peg into a round hole, you really need to have that right level of confidence that tech that will and should absolutely be your source of truth from a data perspective, from a visibility perspective, does have all of the right level of capabilities for you as an organization based off of what your priorities are, what's your strategy, and also forward thinking in terms of what is that roadmap, what is that end game for you as an organization. So if self-services is that final utopian state, that end game that you want to achieve, where it's an Amazon style like experience where your hiring managers or stakeholders go into the tech, do what they need, and jobs are good, and then again, that tech capabilities, the tech that is selected is so important and so crucial versus your operational element, because there will always be some sort of human intervention or some sort of human touch that it's required as part of something, whether it's at the forefront or whether it's a sort of a supplementary piece there as and if and when is required by the sort of the users that are going to be interacting with that technology. There will always be an element of that, but I would say that tech piece is extremely fundamental to ensure that those capabilities are ironed out and understood based off of your level of maturity as an organization to really address and identify what the solution and what solution is the best solution for you moving forward.
Yeah, and I guess this is where organizations need to be super open book. If you're going in
Yeah.
there, if they're saying, okay, well, let's do an audit or let's explore how we might be able to, work with an intermediary, for example, and if you're going, there's got to be fully open book. I mean, it must be quite difficult in some organizations because there's some stuff that maybe people want to brush
Yeah.
under the carpet a little bit. And this is where it's key that the senior stakeholders that are driving this within the organization have a clear mandate and a clear reason, whether it's from an initial regulatory driver, a driver around value,
and then monetary driver. There's a whole host of kind of efficiencies and values that come into this as well. But again, and to your point, I think there needs to be an element of transparency there, whether it's, and regardless of which angle you're looking at this from. If you're looking at it to kind of take that ownership and do something as an organization yourself with your in-house teams that you have to bolster those capabilities, or whether you're looking to bring in, as we're sort of discussing, a third-party intermediary to provide and support. There's no right or wrong answer, but I think really the foundation and the fundamental element is to really be transparent, be honest, to your point, really take the time and energy to really evaluate truly where on those maturity spectrums, where exactly in terms of visibility, oversight, objectives that you really are at today versus that future state.
Yeah, and it's also, I'd like to sort of put a word of encouragement out there to organizations that are looking to try and address this. You do see people starting at a very basic level of addressing this and thinking, I've got no data, our processes are all over the place, people are just doing what they want, they're getting around headcount freezes, some of this stuff isn't compliant, we can't keep on top of it because our procurement team's too lean and it's just all happening in the background. There is a route forward. We're seeing organizations, I'm sure you're seeing this as well, whether they're working with intermediaries or whether they're doing it directly, addressing this problem, moving forward,
is the first step,
making progress and actually getting benefits from it, because it's so greenfield.
Exactly.
The benefits are absolutely massive, because where this stuff is just not being addressed, and it's been too difficult in too many different ways, that has now changed. So I think you're right. When you look at that maturity and you look at what's the best fit for that particular organization, there's going to be the elements of when you look at even just what they want to achieve right now, but maybe with a little bit of a mindset on what's step 2 and what's step 3 in an ideal world, that's going to tie into what kind of tech capability does that require? How are those needs going to be met? And then you've got the in-house capabilities, whether the organization is just going to do it themselves, which some organizations are absolutely capable of.
They're well equipped to do that.
Have the resources to do it. But also looking at those in-house capabilities, if they are bringing in a third party, how will the third party augment those capabilities effectively? Are people's toes going to get trodden on?
Exactly.
I've spoken. We did a little demo session at the CPC Consultancy Procurement Council summit recently, which was really cool. And it was interesting. We were showing off our Scope IQ tool using generative AI to build requirement specifications. And one of the questions that we got asked by procurement, one of the things that kind of sometimes comes up is, is AI, which jobs in procurement is AI going to take? And my response to that is, it's a tool, and it should be used by procurement people to push away the more transactional, very basic things that they might be having their time taken up with, and move towards more strategic kind of input, and actually elevate what they're doing. It's a tool to allow them to get away from the stuff that they should be automating. So that's the kind of AI viewpoint. And my view on that is, it's not necessarily AI that's going to take people's jobs. It's people that use AI. They're going to take other people's jobs. But from a third party perspective, if an MSP is coming in, how would you kind of address that to the market in terms of people thinking, if this MSP comes in, does that mean my job's under threat as a procurement person, or what's that going to mean?
Yeah, and this is one of the most common challenges that, coming from an MSP background, I have to face ultimately. And what I always say to clients is that there isn't a right or wrong in this. Naturally, being somewhat biased, I'd want the decision to be come in MSP and, you know, support us, and this is what we want. But I guess if I take a step back from that and really look at what is right for the client, what's right for the organization, because at the end of the day, regardless of whether you're looking at this in-house as an organization or you know, I am a third party coming in to support, that should be my ultimate goal and mindset, is what is the right solution for you as an organization to be able to build a strong foundation, get the right level of adoption, ensure you've got the right level of tech to automate and provide some quick wins and efficiencies to then move up that maturity roadmap chain. So I think that the key thing would be why, and this is again the question that gets asked, is why should I outsource this to an MSP? What is going to provide me in terms of efficiencies and benefit to give this to you, MSP, to do this, as opposed to try and invest that same time, energy, and cost internally? Now, there's a few elements here, and I think the key thing that as an MSP we strive to do is, again, ensure that whatever solution, support we are and service we are providing to an organization, it is tailored and customized specifically for them as an organization based off of what their objectives are. And then again, you know, I've mentioned an element of maturity roadmap here because there's always room for improvement. And I say that because for some organizations, as we've sort of talked about, starting off really simplistic with a simple, non-complex foundation just to start to get some of that adoption and uptake with new ways of working and a different mindset to changing those buying behaviors, the best way is to start off small. And then again, there's right, you've achieved this, you've addressed this, it's taken you X amount of time to get the success, get the drivers, get the ROI that you wanted for that. You've got the visibility that you need. What's the next step? So the key thing is having an MSP, if you are looking to engage an MSP, it's have them work in harmonization with your internal in-house teams. So again, if it means starting off small and looking at technology to automate certain elements below a certain dollar threshold. So for instance, if you want to give your MSP everything in full control to manage for requests that sit under $100,000, for instance, let's say, then again, that gives you, in terms of your in-house capabilities, to look on some of those and focus on some of those slightly more higher dollar values where actually you need slightly more robust expertise and capabilities, and that time just, it works better. Your in-house teams have that time to manage and prioritize spend requirements between $100,000 to $500,000, say, for instance. Or if you want to throw in an element of self-service, then again, you could have, say, any requests up to $50,000, they will be completely self-serviced by your hiring communities, your stakeholders, with the automations that the tech provides for them to be able to do. So, you know, the element of AI that you mentioned within the Zivio tool, I think that's a brilliant example to say, actually, there is enough confidence within the tech capabilities to ensure that what will be achieved effectively and correctly. And there will be no gray area there. So again, if that's the first level, and then you have an MSP to come in and supplement and support that beyond $50,000 to say $250K, those are the requirements that then the MSP will provide a little bit of hand-holding and support. And then anything above that remains with your in-house capabilities. But it's working out the solution that works in harmonization with the capabilities that you have, or some of the areas, I don't want to say capabilities that an organization doesn't have, because that sort of sounds like there's negative connotations there, but I think any elements that would be deemed as slightly less strategic, where actually that time and energy is not able to be provided because of the level of day-to-day interactions, day-to-day administration that's needed, then again, that just makes sense to sort of say, either we have the confidence that our current hiring managers and stakeholders have the full ability to kind of do that themselves, or actually we're bringing in an intermediary, we're bringing in an MSP for them to provide that level of guidance, because we just don't want to focus our time and energy on some of those lower dollar value requirements. So I guess the key thing, what I'm trying to say in a very roundabout fashion, is it's never a one size fits all model. And I think the key, if you are either interested in exploring a partnership with an MSP or have an existing partnership with an MSP, it's you need to work out what works in harmonization with your strengths and your capabilities as an organization. And I think this is where that level of transparency and that honesty comes in, is to really say, put your hands up and say, okay, this is an area we don't do quite well, or we do it well, but we just don't want to focus on it anymore because we don't have the time, we don't have the resources. We want you to do this. But then ensuring that whatever that structure is in place, there are clear handshakes and interactions to make it a cohesive, to make it a complementary overall end-to-end solution, to tie it all together and bring it all together.
Yeah, and the organization, they need to have objectives and they need to push for those objectives, whether they're doing it internally or they're bringing in a third party.
Absolutely.
Cut the risk, save costs, drive value. You know, these are objectives that, whether that's an internal responsibility or it's a shared responsibility with a third party, or it's really pushed out to the third party.
And I think hold your MSPs accountable as well. I think that's one thing which maybe not everybody will agree with me, but if that is a conversation you're looking to have, to bring in an MSP, set those objectives and set those boundaries and hold them accountable. If you've agreed that they need to provide you X level of ROI within Y level of time, hold them accountable to that. Not that you wouldn't anyway, and I know we're certainly, again, seeing on this side, there are always levels of SLAs and KPIs that need to be achieved, but again, truly set those boundaries to ensure that there isn't any overlap and that you as an organization are as comfortable with the service and the support that you are getting, and it is exactly tailored to what you are desiring to achieve in terms of your objectives.
Yeah, I'd imagine most MSPs would love to be pushed on business outcomes for this, because
absolutely, if
an organization's saying, I want X amount of savings, then the MSP or the intermediary can say, okay, well, all of this stuff that's going on direct award has got to go through competitive bid, because you're probably going to save 15 to 20% just by putting it through competitive bidding. So then the process is moving forward. Then the company's doing it in a more sophisticated way, and they're leveling up, increasing their value. I mean, we as I said, we see all sides of it. We see sides of it where the organization is perfectly capable of doing it themselves, and they're perfectly capable of adopting the technology directly and doing it that way. We see organizations where working via a third party, the tech solution, as you say, enables the service, is an enabler for the service that third party are providing, and so therefore it kind of sits outside in a bubble, which makes it easier for them to adopt the technology. And we see other situations where there's just no way the procurement teams could do it themselves, because they're way too stretched as it is. You know, clearly you need to have the right drivers internally, people within the procurement team going, we are missing, there's a massive gap here, and we've got to do something about that. And we can strategically drive it, but certainly in the early stages of the first instance, we need someone to help us with this and do some of the heavy lifting, because then if you're providing data and you're kind of elevating that function, you're getting more granularity and more control over it, that's where the internal procurement team can do stuff with that data. They can make recommendations, they can look at supplier performance, they can look at how things are being delivered, hold their stakeholders accountable, hold their suppliers accountable. So it's, as you say, one size doesn't fit all. It's genuinely about just problem solving. It's a problem solving exercise. What's the most effective way to do it? Which brings me on to kind of the last kind of core point that I wanted to really get into, which was, I'd be interested to know, just anecdotally, if you could give maybe even some examples of where you've seen this, but just how do organizations kind of move up the value chain within this kind of problem solving exercise or service delivery?
And I think that's a really brilliant question. So I've mentioned maturity roadmap a number of times already. And I think that's really key to kind of tie in how clients can move up that value chain, because I think if you've got a maturity roadmap, you are taking into consideration that whatever you are implementing today as this new structure or a refined structure is there's room for improvement, and there's always room for improvement. But what you are then doing, and I think if you build out a maturity roadmap or have the intention to build out a maturity roadmap at some point, what you are doing is you are identifying areas to say, okay, this was my objective for today's landscape. And in, say, I don't know, 12 months time, Y is going to be my objective. So I guess if we try and quantify that a little bit to give slightly more real examples, visibility today as your first step could be your main objective. So, and when I say visibility, you can absolutely, I've had organizations that have not just left that visibility piece loose and open-ended, they've quantified that, where they've said, actually, within 12 months or within an X period of time, having launched an organization, what the intention is to have actually anything that is deemed within this particular process, within these particular stages, 90% achievement every quarter or something along those lines. So the intention is to have less, and I guess if I make this a little bit more clearer, so if you have launched, say, I don't know, Zivio as the technology that's being utilized to support and bolster and give you that visibility from an SOW spend perspective, but you are only targeting 2 locations, the UK and the US, and you are targeting one core category internally, which is your IT category. Now you can say and quantify that I want visibility, but what level of visibility I want is that anything that is within these boundaries of the UK, US locations and the IT category, I want to ensure anything outside of Zivio that is processed with the technology that was, say, being utilized pre the deployment of Zivio, as an example, Ariba. I want to ensure that actually there is 90% uptake of the data trickling through that program every quarter within that space, as opposed to trickling through Ariba, which was the previous landscape and the previous technology. So there's elements of that where, again, set those boundaries. This is a starting point. Once you've achieved that, the expectation would be, in most cases, if you've got right level of adoption, right level of processes that are structured out, you're going to pretty much get 100% of that adoption. You're going to, with time, you're going to get that 100% success rate. And then moving into what are some of those next stages. So you've achieved your visibility, you've started to get some insights into what your data is looking like and what that data landscape is telling you. That then is reliant on what is that data telling you. So is there an element of focusing and targeting on, okay, I've got that level of visibility, but what I've now identified as part of that is I'm out of the 20 suppliers that I've onboarded to be enrolled into this program, I've only got uptake of 5 of those suppliers being engaged. So actually then the next step might be that supplier optimization element to say, right, so what elements and processes that can I implement into this, and what change can I bring into this to encourage more adoption and more usage and engagement of those 20 PSL suppliers that I have, as opposed to just the top 5. And then with that, you could stem out, and there could be elements of cost savings that come into that as well, because those top 5 suppliers, based off the data visibility that you've acquired, might be the top 5 most expensive suppliers. So there's different elements that come into that. And I think, again, as we're saying, there's never a right or wrong answer. I think it needs to be very tailored and specific to what you as an organization are looking to drive. Cost, in most cases, if not all, is always the biggest determinator, or the biggest driver even. But I think it's, how do you get to that cost control, those cost saving elements, by ensuring that you've got the right level of foundation to be able to work to that. So again, if you have limited visibility, how are you going to bring in objectives to cut costs if you don't know what your spend is actually doing today and how those buying behaviors are today? So by getting that level of visibility and getting those data insights, it equips you to understand trends, understand areas of efficiencies, understand areas that actually can be left as is because they're working perfectly fine. But just, I guess, to give a little bit of a taster of some of those examples of what could be, I would say that sort of visibility piece, and then kind of looking at what is that data telling you once you've got that visibility from a whether it's cost control, whether it's supply optimization linked in with cost control, or actually is there an element that's highlighted to say from an operational process cycle time efficiency, they are ludicrous timelines. It's taking requesters or hiring managers and stakeholders say, I don't know, 5 weeks to go from inception to sourcing to fulfillment to actually getting an SOW contract signed and sealed with the supplier. Why is it taking 5 weeks? Start to peel away those layers. It's taking
that'd be quite quick for some people.
Absolutely, absolutely. But there's things like that where, you know, taking into consideration that time scale, if that is something, then are there certain quick wins, low-hanging fruits from a tech perspective? Can you automate certain elements that much more to reduce that 5 weeks to say 3 weeks? And then if your intention is reduce it even more from 3 weeks to 1 week, say perhaps, what other areas, aside from automating some more of the tech and bringing some of those tech efficiencies, what are there any operational efficiencies that can be brought into this? And again, they all tend to, those value drivers all tend to kind of work in line with that cost control, because there's always a branch that leads in to, if you're trying to save time is money, essentially. So if you're cutting the time scales down, you are naturally going to start to cut some costs down as well. So there's a whole host of different elements, but just as a little bit of a snippet and a teaser, I'd say those are some of the kind of the common elements that come into play there.
Yeah, the cost one is, I find that fascinating because, you know, it just depends how people are measuring it at the moment, because for a lot of organizations, and certainly a lot of procurement organizations within large companies, their assessment of cost or their KPIs based on cost might be purely at the point of sourcing.
Yeah, absolutely.
So,
it might be extremely subjective as well.
Yeah, exactly. And it's like, well, what happens downstream? What's happening in terms of the overall, what's the actual cost versus the original contracted cost? And, you know,
exactly.
and even if you just look at it around sourcing, well, there's so much you can do around cost with that. But then, you, like you say, you start bringing in efficiencies and things like that, which can be initially harder for people to conceptualize measuring, whereas just, you know, a sourcing cost of actually the budget was X and the contracted price was Y, and we've saved 15% on the budget price, or actually the highest bid was X and the contracted price was Y, we've saved 20% against the highest bid. Those things are very hard, you know, hard cost savings that are easy to measure. Whereas you start getting into the more, that there's still huge benefits to be built out of getting into the efficiency savings and you know, how critical it is to get to market and deliver these services for your organization in a timely manner, and then into the, you know, supplier performance and what's actually, are people giving you, you know, really good looking rate cards and then just taking forever to deliver it and having extension after extension. But it brings up a question in my mind for you, in the sense that when people are going traveling or trying to move up this maturity curve, what are you seeing in terms of how people are able to justify the business case? Because I guess for a lot of organizations, because this is an emerging area, not everybody hasn't got this sorted. It's not mature like contingent workforce solutions. People must find it hard to build that initial business case. How are you seeing that, where people are kind of, are they iterating the business case or backing it up, starting small, or how do you see people approaching that?
Yeah, and I think that's such a valid question, because I would say it's a completely mixed bag. So I say that with the caveat, it's completely mixed bag, but I do tend to see a little bit of a trend, in the sense that a lot of organizations, and again, I think the element of first generation versus second generation comes into this as well. So for a lot of the first generation clients, you know, they have not much of a clue. They really need a lot of support to sort of guide them to say, this is the justification for my business case, to take up to their senior leadership team. A lot of the times what is included as part of that in terms of value add to be able to move up that value chain really are some of those low-hanging fruits. So visibility, first and foremost. Again, is that something that you are going to quantify specifically, or are you just going to say, we'll see how it goes? Let's get as much of this visibility and data traction as we can. But then again, there's always a cost element that comes into that as well. So again, taking into account from the simplicity perspective, those immediate quick wins or those low-hanging fruits, are there elements that from an upstream perspective that you can try and secure some form of cost savings? So if misclassification is a little bit of a struggle, or actually you're not quite sure if it is indeed a challenge for you as an organization because you don't have the visibility, but you have an inkling that it might be because you know that you don't have your hands around that spend, you don't have that visibility, then again, some of those upstream activities to quantify that. Are there certain operational tech enabled elements that can be fed into that process to really justify and quantify, right, this is what we are expecting to achieve just by putting in certain protocols, processes, and governances in place for those upstream activities? Now, again, you could have the same thing for some of those downstream activities as well, where actually just by saying, okay, we have limited visibility, but we know there's a challenge here. What we also want to do is we want to bring in some sort of elements of mandate. So whether that mandate means from a bid perspective, we want to drive costs and generate some of those savings to say, okay, any requirement over, say, $500,000 up to $1 million needs to be mandatory and competitively bid out to 6 suppliers at a bare minimum. So again, that will, and then I think we then come into the piece that you mentioned is how are those quantified from a hard saving versus soft savings perspective? That will be reliant on how you as an organization operate to an extent, but also in terms of what means do you have to be able to really quantify those. And there's different elements there. And I think what I do tend to see with some of the more mature clients is that they'll already have targets from a procurement perspective where their CPOs, their CFOs have already given them, say for the next 5 years, this is a cost saving target. And they've said, we don't really care how you achieve those, but we just need you to secure X amount of cost saving targets and initiatives within 5 years. So that's then where sometimes there's a level of creativity that can come into that. That again, based on if you are a slightly more mature organization, there will be some really well-versed, well-oiled scenarios where you know that you can achieve some hard cost savings already that will add to those targets and those initiatives. But then are actually working with and peeling away the layers as for you as an organization, what are those challenges? And again, this is where that honesty, transparency piece comes in as well, really to understand, okay, so we know this works for us. We know that will form part of that overall cost saving target and initiative, but are there other elements that might be a little bit subjective, but we can still prove it, we can justify it, and we can bring in certain means and certain processes and protocols to ensure that that's achieved? Is that going to work? But again, I think there is always an element of, there is always room for improvement. So there's always an element of having a maturity roadmap. And I think even if that is forms part of your justification for your business case, to say, this is a starting point that we're doing, and we want to get to this, or we're not quite sure what we want to get to, but we know that there will be room for improvement. Even that, I think, as a starting point, and then reevaluate that in 12 months, 18 months down the line, I think is a great way to start.
Yeah, absolutely. And if you're dealing with provable results,
exactly,
it's always much easier to justify and build that business case. That's what people want to see. Yep. Show me the money.
Exactly, absolutely.
So I'm quite excited about the way the market is progressing. And I find it really interesting listening to you talk about what you're seeing in terms of maturity levels and things like that. Just to kind of finish off, what if you look at the next 12 months? And I know often the cycle times for these kind of big programs, especially with the really large organizations, can be quite long term. But over the next 12 months, sorry, in your expectation, what do you think you're going to see more of? Do you think you're going to see more people starting on this journey, or more people who are already on the journey just moving up the value chain? Do you think there's going to be a trend either way on that?
I think it's going to be personally, and this might be a little bit controversial, a bit bold, but I think there's going to be a fair 50-50 split.
Right.
And I say that purely because if you look at your EMEA markets, I think they are somewhat less mature comparatively to the US markets. And then if you look at the APAC markets, they are completely down that level of maturity scale. There's still a lot of education, still a lot of awareness that is needed within those markets. And I say that because that for me is I'm trying to justify the 50-50 split, because I think you're going to have, based on what market you're looking at, you are going to have some organizations that are saying, right, okay, we've done the basics, we want to keep go. It's, you know, the spend levels that we're talking about when it comes to the SOW world, the services procurement world, are not slowing down. And there's a number of elements that come into that, but it has evolved and grown substantially, I would say, even over the last 3 years. And if we look at the last 5 years, even more so. And then if we take back the last 7 years, even more so. And, you know, Johnny, you and I are kind of proof of that as well. We've seen how this industry and market is evolving. But I guess going back to the question that you've asked is, I think there'll be a fair amount of organizations that have said, right, okay, we've got the basics, we want to keep moving. This spend area is not slowing down for us. We've got our visibility. We know what we're doing. We know what we want to achieve. We want to keep going. We want to keep moving up that maturity roadmap. And I think there will come a point where we will be talking relatively very quickly about a fully self-service process. And I mentioned this sort of Amazon style experience where I have conversations with more and more clients, and that's what they want. That is the utopian future state for them. That's what they want to achieve. Whether they can get there in the next 12 months, I think that's a whole different conversation, but that's what they want to get to at some point. But then you also, that sort of the remainder of the 50%, I think, is where you still have some markets, so the APAC regions, and some European locations, I would still say within EMEA, where they're still relatively in their infancy stages. They're still starting to just wrap their heads around what is statement of work for us as an organization. What does statement of work mean within the industry? So I think there's still a bit of a journey for those type of clients to go on. But again, it's fast moving. The spend levels we know have evolved so much, as we've already said. So there is going to be not a single organization that is not going to be thinking about this SOW services procurement management side of things within the next 12 months.
Yeah, I think it's really exciting. And like you say, it's accelerating. Organizations are spending more on services.
Yeah.
You know, new services are needing to be adopted all of the time as technology changes and the whole market moves so quickly. And I think the other thing that's accelerating is the recognition of the problem and recognition that solutions are available. So yeah, I think it's going to be a really exciting time. And obviously with the dynamic market that we're operating in, things move quickly, so change happens. I feel like it's just a more accelerated pace every year. But listen, thank you so much, Dan. I really enjoyed that.
Thank you for having me.
It's great to dive into these topics and really kind of get into the detail. And hopefully people will find that useful in terms of us just kind of airing our views and debating this sort of stuff. But I really appreciate your time. So yeah, thank you very much for joining me today. That was great.
Thank you for having me back.
Excellent. I'll catch up with you again soon.
Yeah, brilliant. Thank you.
Bye.